Alright guys, so in this video, I'm going to be showing the easiest way to tell the difference between the Titanic and the Olympic and the entire timeline between 1912 and 1913, the renovations that the Titanic underwent during its construction to make it easy to identify it in comparison to the Olympic. So you can just take a look at the Titanic and Olympic side by side. Looking at both of these ships, yes, the Titanic was slightly bigger, but you're really not going to be able to identify that if you're just an average person looking at the ships. The easiest way to identify the difference is if you zoom in on the A deck, which is located directly under the lifeboats. You can see the entire A deck is wide open on the Olympic compared to the Titanic, with kind of half of it covered with windows and the other half open like the Olympic. Another extremely easy way to tell the difference, and this was a renovation that the Titanic took after the Olympic was launched, and they realized that a lot of the first class passengers were not using the B deck enclosed promenade. If you look at B deck, all of those square windows that are perfectly aligned, that was a promenade deck. There was a bunch of space for people to walk. They were not using it. So they decided on Titanic to put in the first class private promenade decks. They decided to put in the Cafe Parisien. And that's why on the Titanic, the B deck windows are a lot different when you look at the way they're spaced versus on the Olympic. Looks like they're slightly bigger, the square windows on the Olympic, and they are all almost kind of right in a perfect line outside of the gangway door. And then on the Titanic, you can see they're a lot more sporadic, a lot more spread out because of the private promenade decks, one on each side, and the extra cafe. Now, when it comes to the original build, if you look at the Olympic and Titanic, you can see the Olympic is a different color here, but just in general, this is when the ships were being built. The Titanic originally had a completely open A-deck promenade, and it had, virtually identical B-deck square windows. I think that's why people get confused. Again, the reason they changed it was like Titanic received a renovation before it was even on its maiden voyage, because they realized that none of the first class passengers were using the B-deck promenade. They didn't need to use that space as public space. Let's make an upgrade. Let's add a promenade cafe, which was unheard of on ships back in the early 1900s. Let's add a private promenade deck for the extremely expensive parlor suites. That's why those were changed later on. So it's like people see this photo and they're like, the Titanic and Olympic are identical. Well, yes, the Titanic was built virtually identical, but they did end up making some key changes on it that make it really easy to identify the difference between the Titanic and the Olympic. When it comes to some of the images and the disputed photos, was it the Olympic, was it the Titanic? This is a pretty good image. This is the B-deck public promenade that does not exist on Titanic. That is why we know for sure this is the Olympic. These are some colorized photos. Someone used AI to make the photos color, so this is not like a perfect thing, but any photo of the Grand Staircase, unfortunately, they are all of the Olympic, because the Olympic was the first ship. Believe it or not, the Olympic got a lot more fanfare than the Titanic because it was the first one. Got all the photographs of all the main areas. You can see this is also the Olympic. This is just a third class room. This is the Olympic. This was second class, their main staircase where everyone kind of conjugated there. This is a first class stateroom. This is also the Olympic. There's another, grand staircase photo of the Olympic. Just a beautiful, beautiful dome. You could even see it from here, how pretty that looks. This is the swimming pool. Virtually identical on the Titanic, but this is, again, the Olympic. You can see this is the third class main stairway towards the stern of the ship. This is also the Olympic as well. And then this is another image that a lot of people get wrong. This image of the propellers is actually the Olympic while it was being repaired, not the Titanic, right around 1912. A lot of people think that's the Titanic. I originally thought it was the Titanic, but when it comes to the Olympic, There's a sweet photo of it. That's when it was in camo. Yeah, a lot of people like those images. It does look pretty cool. During the war, it became a camo ship, and it did suffer a better fate than the Britannic, to where it survived the war and it made it all the way to the 1930s before it was scrapped. Pretty crazy considering how, you know, famous the Titanic is. Crazy that the Olympic just got scrapped and the Grand Staircase just, I mean, they demolished the Grand Staircase. That would be unheard of today, considering how, you know, imagine if they somehow kept the Olympic alive. I wonder what condition it would be in. They would have to completely renovate it. I mean, it would just be so old. But it got scrapped in the 1930s. They did end up adding a Promenade Cafe onto the Olympic, but that was not until after the Titanic, well after the Titanic sunk. So that might have also confused people as well. And then take a look at this. Are we kidding with this, folks? Come on. Build a replica of the RMS Olympic. We gotta build the Titanic 2 before this. This was created in 2018. I'll be honest, this was created by me. I'm kidding. We need the Titanic. The argument is they're like, oh, the Olympic was better than the Titanic because it didn't sink. And yes, I agree. I think the Olympic, it's kind of like the polar opposite to where all the common people think because of the 97 movie, the Titanic was so much better than every other ship of its time. But if you went back to like 1911, 1912, 90% of the people would be talking about the Olympic, not the Titanic, because it was the first ship of its time. The Titanic, while it was more luxurious, it was very, very similar to the Olympic. So it's like, it's almost backwards to where now we're all obsessed with the Titanic when really the Olympic was the one that had all the headlines because it was the first of its kind. Then you had the Titanic. Of course, it sinks 5 days into service. And then the Britannic, which never was able to be used, you know, as a passenger ocean liner. It immediately goes into service and strikes the German mine, and unfortunately sinks after 9 months, really never being able to realize its true potential. So it is true, the Olympic by far was the most successful out of the big three. Titanic was the most famous, Britannic was supposed to be the most luxurious, and the Olympic kind of gets forgotten about, but that is just, again, the main difference. It's very easy to tell, and this is why I just don't think people really understand that there is a very easy, identifiable difference between the Titanic and the Olympic. If you look at the wreck photos of the Titanic, people think, well, it was the Olympic that sunk. It's simply not possible based on the wreck photos. The reason that enclosed A-deck Promenade exists, and you can see the enclosed A-deck Promenade in the wreck photos at the bottom of the Atlantic, the reason that exists is because the Titanic was made after the Olympic. That was an improvement. You can also tell it's the Titanic in the wreck photos based on the B-class window spacing and the fact that they're slightly smaller. It's those square windows that also give it away as well. So just based on the wreck photos and the fact that this happened in 1912 and the fact that the Olympic in 1912 had a completely open A-deck Promenade and also a B-deck Promenade with those square windows kind of all being identical, it is impossible for the ship on the bottom of the ocean to be the Olympic. The Titanic was launched after it, so they made the improvement, and that's why it's enclosed. Right, so I just think there's a little bit of confusion there, but it is very easy to identify them if you understand the history, guys. But either way, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description.